Welcome to another scholarship highlight brought to you by the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University School of Law. This series is part of the Center's broader effort to deepen the scholarly discussion around firearms law by engaging directly with some of the many scholars who are producing insightful and innovative work in the area. I'm Jake Charles, Executive Director of the Center, and this week we're joined by Kristin Goss, the Kevin D. Gorder Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Firearms Law, and Matt Lacombe, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University. We're going to be talking with them about their article, Do Courts Change Politics? Heller and the Limits of Policy Feedback Effects, recently published in the Emory Law Journal. Thanks for being here, Kristin and Matt.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
In a nutshell, what's the article about?
So on a high level, the goal of the article is to try to identify both the first order, but especially the sort of second order effects of Heller and then the related McDonald case. So one way we can think about court decisions is as being instances of policy change. And what we sought to do here is to look at the ways in which the policy change enacted by the court then impacted existing laws around the country, but then especially the sort of politics surrounding gun control. Did it impact the sorts of agendas that lawmakers pursued in regards to gun control? Did it impact the strategies of interest groups on each side of the issue? Did it impact public opinion? And so on. Obviously, Heller is a big deal, but what we really sought to do here is to look at what exactly it did, how exactly it impacted gun politics downstream.
Yeah. And so what brought you to write this article?
So there was a big symposium held at Emory Law School on the gun topic. And this is this question of sort of what Heller had accomplished is something that's been kicking around in activist circles, a little bit in academic circles as well. And this just seemed like a great opportunity to do kind of a systematic examination of from a political science perspective, as Matt mentioned, of what effects this policy change had. And so, we took this opportunity and ran with it in the tradition of Gerald Rosenberg from University of Chicago and his landmark book, The Hollow Hope. We sort of picked up his methods and his insights and, applied them to the case of guns.
Yeah, so this next question kind of gets at your last answer there, but who do you see this article being in discussion with and conversation with? What scholarly discussions are you hoping to change or to provoke as a result of this? There's the one about the study of Brown that you talked about, the article that you talked about a little bit now, but are there other conversations, either scholarly, academic, or otherwise, that you are joining or hoping to change as a result of this article?
Yeah, so in addition to the Hollow Hope work that Kristin mentioned, there's also a tradition in political science referred to as policy feedback, which, as I said earlier, tends to focus on the sort of downstream second order effects that policies have on politics, how policies can sort of reshape politics moving forward. That area of inquiry hasn't typically focused on the role that court cases can play in changing politics downstream. And so one of the things we hope to accomplish with this article is to look at the extent to which we might think of court cases as being policies that reshuffle politics, that sort of reshape the behavior of the mass public and of relevant organizations.
And if I could just elaborate on one additional point related to that. So the Hollow Hope was really about whether groups on the left, progressive groups, are putting too much stock in litigation to produce social change. And we were actually interested in whether groups on the right might also be subject to, the same sorts of concerns or strategic missteps. So I think it was interesting that I think the theory was largely validated using a case from the right, even though the theory had been developed using cases on the left.
Yeah. And so diving into the article a little bit, you note at the beginning how you're testing this hypothesis of what Heller actually did. And there was a lot of commentary at the time, at least public commentary, that Heller was big. It was a watershed case, and it did change federal constitutional law, but you note the mixed kind of reception that it received. Some groups praised it, some groups criticized it, but a lot of people thought it actually wasn't as big of a deal for those who have been in the movement for a long time. And you talk about how there was at least some silver lining for gun regulation groups. Can you talk a little bit about what they saw as silver lining in a decision that announced an individual right to own firearms?
Kristin, do you want to go, or I can jump in?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, I think that some of the long-term gun control advocates saw in this ruling the potential to undermine the gun rights side's kind of foundational political argument, which is that every new gun law is potentially a step down a slippery slope that will eventually lead to tyranny or fascism in the United States, and that by putting up essentially a firewall around the individual right to have a firearm for personal use in the home, the force of that slippery slope argument would be lost, and that this might create a space where you could have an honest debate without that fear of some sort of dire consequence. And I think that was it was an interesting argument. It seemed to make a lot of sense at the time. I'm not sure that gun politics has quieted down any for the fact that the court has found an individual right protected in the Second Amendment.
Right. Did you want to weigh in on that too, Matt?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that, it's a sort of interesting case study, and that, one of the ways the NRA tends to go about mobilizing people is by using threat. I mean, for a long time, those threat-based appeals would focus on the potential for, total disarmament to occur, gun confiscation to occur. And so, this was an interesting opportunity to assess the extent to which those sorts of arguments were or were not, on the table any longer.
Yeah, and so you both talked about how you use this policy feedback theory to study the effect of Heller. Can you tell us a little bit about what policy feedback theory is and what you were testing for here?
So policy feedback theory it includes like a really wide range of studies, actually, but on a high level, it's interested in examining the extent to which policy changes alter politics. And we look at alterations to politics in a number of different ways. One is the sorts of agenda, the legislative agendas that lawmakers are pursuing. Another is the agenda of interest groups and the sorts of policies that they're pursuing and that they're emphasizing in their appeals to members. Another is the sort of organizational capacities of groups. So sometimes what we've seen in other cases of policy feedback is that there's a particular policy change, and that is then either demobilizing or mobilizing for citizens who are affected by the policy change. And then we also looked at sort of mass sentiment, whether public opinion would be altered by the policy change, which is another area of study that's been popular. And I think one of the, so early on in the study of policy feedback, I think a lot of it focused on cases in which it did in fact occur. And there's more recently been some scholarship looking at the sort of limits of policy feedback and reasons why it might not occur. And as it turns out, I think our article here contributes to that part of the literature, why we might actually not expect to see these feedback effects in all cases.
Yeah. So you talked about some of the areas that you studied. Why did you choose those? Is that because policy feedback theory says these are the areas where we'd expect to see the feedback effects? Is it because you looked at the Second Amendment landscape and thought, here were some areas where we think a Second Amendment public policy is going to have effects? And are there other areas that you would have wanted to study, but for a lack of reliable data?
Yeah, I mean, I think we picked the outcome measures through a variety of, for a variety of reasons, some of which you've mentioned. So we looked at the Hall of Hope book, and what kinds of measures did he collect that we could also collect? So thinking about changes in group resources, group mobilization would be one example. We also did sort of what you mentioned, sort of inductively thinking about what kinds of changes would we expect if this ruling had really had an impact on politics. So for example, we would have expected a reduction in handgun ban bills being introduced at the state level. And, in fact, what we find is there were so few handgun ban bills introduced that even if it dropped from 1 per year to 0, it really didn't, there wasn't really a big issue to begin with, right? So the court isn't, intervening and calling a halt to some major agenda on the part of state lawmakers. We looked at, group resources, group strategies, group rhetoric, group memberships, group finances, and really, I think with the exception of a change in strategies among gun rights groups, we found, more or less no effects, maybe a little bit of a rhetorical effect, which Matt can talk about, but it was just everything we looked for. We just couldn't find any that Heller had sort of this big impact, except that a lot more people brought a lot more gun rights lawsuits, most of which were unsuccessful. And so, I guess it was good for lawyers, but other than that, I just didn't see that much of an impact. So I think you were also asking about what, were there types of outcomes that we might have wanted to measure, where we might have seen an effect, but we just couldn't get the data. I think one, and Matt can chime in on this as well. One part of policy feedback theory thinks about people's relationship with the state in an emotional sense, or in a sense of feeling included, empowered, like a full citizen. And I think I would be curious to know how Heller affected gun owners and people who are part of a gun culture, for whom gun ownership is an important identity. How that decision may have affected their feelings of inclusion within the state. That's something that's really hard to measure, and we didn't have sort of long-term data that would allow us to take a look at that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And the only thing I would add along those lines of what Kristin was saying at the end about how Heller may have affected gun owners and folks who strongly sort of identify with gun ownership socially, I think that would be interesting. I also think it would be interesting to see if there were any backlash effects among gun regulation supporters who, despite the sort of lack of substantive effects we identified, may have felt sort of may have been sort of a wake-up call to them. It doesn't show up in the more material measures that we looked at, and it doesn't show up in the sort of aggregate public opinion trends we looked at. But in an ideal world, if we could have sort of measured public opinion in a more nuanced way following the decisions, that may have been interesting to see. There are a number of hypotheses that are possible. It's possible that it would have demobilized gun regulation supporters who would have felt, deflated, but it's also possible it would have sort of woken them up. And then on the gun rights side, it's also possible that it would provide momentum to folks, but it's also possible that it would lead to feelings of complacency. And that stuff is all really difficult to measure, especially retroactively.
So let me ask about one of the measures that you looked at, and that's whether state legislators were declining to introduce new handgun bans or repealing junk gun bans. And I'm wondering what you think of, you mentioned this view early in the article where some gun regulation proponents liked Heller, not just because it took away the slippery slope argument, but because it also said the Second Amendment's not absolute, right? It's not this unlimited right that some gun rights proponents wanted. Do you think that there would have been an effect of some pro-regulation groups enacting more laws after Heller because there was kind of these, Heller maybe paved a way to permissible gun regulations? Is that something that you think could have happened? Is that something you saw when you were looking at it, or it might be in the data?
I don't think we really looked for that systematically. And it sort of feels to me that the kinds of laws that gun control groups were seeking were mainstream, not threatened by Heller, we looked at sort of whether the agendas or the activities seemed to amp up, or the ambitions of gun control groups, and we just didn't really see that. I think it was, the gun politics was just going along in this stream, and then the court was going along in this stream, and the two, really didn't intersect in any meaningful way.
Yeah, as far as I could tell, when we dug into all of this, if there were sort of changes that were related to the sort of field, or the potential for what could come, that would be seen in the agendas of gun safety groups, we didn't find them. Like Kristin said, most of the sorts of things they were pursuing before Heller just really weren't touched by it. We're okay both before and after.
So the conclusion that you both have talked about is that you found that Heller actually had pretty limited impact, except for in one area. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about maybe why you think it had such limited impact, and then the area where it did have some impact.
Well, so on a high level, I think the reason it had such limited impact was that in many ways, the gun debate had already sort of gone in a relatively moderate direction. So it probably would have had larger impacts if lots of sort of handgun bans were being pursued prior to Heller. But the fact that the sort of general debate had gone in a relatively moderate direction in terms of the sorts of policies that were on the table is probably why the effects were muted. That would be my main takeaway. I'd be curious what Kristin thinks.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's consistent with a whole bunch of political science theory on the courts and their role in politics, which is that they're a lagging indicator of public opinion, that, courts don't have the sword or the purse, and in Hamilton's phrasing, and, rely on legitimacy and are, for their moral force and their legal force for that matter, and are reluctant to get too far out ahead of public opinion. And so, it would make sense that the politics have progressed in a certain way, and the courts are sort of lagging that change.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of given the policy feedback literature and some of this constrained court view, would we have expected to see an effect from Heller if we were going to see one by now 10 to 12 years out? Is that consistent with the range of policy feedbacks in areas other than courts? Or, could it be possible we might see effects of Heller down the road, or is this kind of the outer bounds of when we'd expect to see that?
I mean, my sense is I think we would have seen, if you're talking about just regular legislative politics, public opinion, social mobilization, I think we've had enough time to assess whether the decision was going to make a difference. Of course, as you all know, who are lawyers, decisions build on one another. And so I think the big question is whether Heller opens the door for more Second Amendment jurisprudence that might, for example, change the standard of review for gun control laws. So if it's opening the door for more court decisions to accumulate that, that could have some impact on the kinds of legislative agendas that we're seeing, or on the mobilization of activists on both sides, that could come at any point. And as Matt and I were finishing the edits on this story, we were eagerly watching the case out of New York State, and wondering if and I guess the court decided not to take it for because it had effectively become moot, I guess. But if the court had taken that case and had used it as an opportunity to shore up the Second Amendment or broaden Second Amendment rights, then we might see political effects, which would be ultimately traced back to Heller. But as of now, 2020, I think the effects have been very, very minimal.
So it sounds like you've answered my final question a little bit, but I'm interested in both of your thoughts on this. Was it surprising to you doing this, or was it already kind of your background assumption, given the literature about courts, that you expected there not to be an effect? Was it surprising, given kind of maybe some of the rhetoric that we heard right around the decision about how watershed it was?
So I say from my perspective, I was not shocked that the sort of discourse around gun politics didn't change much. I wasn't shocked that public opinion around gun politics didn't change much. It's an issue that was already polarizing, in which people already sort of have positions, in which there were pre-established interest groups that already had particular ways of framing the issue. I was surprised at the sort of lack of change in the policy agenda and the lack of changes, you know, in the courts. And maybe I was surprised because that was the area of this I knew the least about going into it. But it did surprise me that it seemed to have mostly null legal effects in addition to the sort of effects on interest group politics and mass opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to summarize it. You know, if you read The Hollow Hope, I think and if you believe that argument, I think the default would be that we were going to find what we found. So, you know, to some extent, I wasn't shocked. And as someone who follows the politics pretty closely, but hadn't collected the data systematically, I had some sense of what had happened since Heller, and, you know, felt like if there had been some earthquake, I would have felt it. But it was interesting to collect the data systematically and just, you know, looking at a whole bunch of different outcomes in different political arenas and just seeing sort of, you know, very, very consistent, minimal to no effects was pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, it's a really fascinating article. Really appreciate you both being here to discuss it with us. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Jake.
And thanks to those of you at home for joining us for another one. You can follow us on Twitter at Duke Firearms Law and go to our website and find all the videos from this series. Thanks.